My spouse secretly tried to conceal her father, from whom she was distant, in our basement after he was forced to leave his home. Upon discovering this, she told me I wouldn't have approved, no matter what. This entire situation began a couple of weeks ago with little, seemingly insignificant incidents that, at the time, appeared almost too trivial to bring up. I realized some of the snacks we keep in the pantry were vanishing faster than usual. Now, I don't want to appear overly concerned with trivial matters, however, I am quite a stickler for routine. I buy the same brand of granola bars every week, and I have a precise understanding of my consumption, 2 per day. My wife dislikes them. She describes them as tasting like cardboard. Initially, I just assumed I'd been eating more than I thought, but then it happened again the very next week. I found myself in the kitchen, fixated on the box, counting like a complete fool, wondering, did I actually eat 6 bars in 3 days? I disregarded the matter, but then something else occurred. One night, as I was in bed, browsing my phone as I usually do, I heard what seemed like soft movement coming from downstairs. Our home is in a fairly calm suburban area, so I'm unaccustomed to hearing random sounds. Initially, I figured it was the house settling or maybe the wind, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps, very slow and measured ones. I got up to investigate, but by the time I reached the stairs, everything had quieted down again. I turned on all the lights and even glanced into the basement, but everything seemed completely normal. My spouse laughed that I was becoming overly cautious due to my true crime listening habits, and in all honesty, I had to admit she had a point. Even so, the sensation that something wasn't quite right remained. A few days passed, and I went down to the basement to get a screwdriver from my tool collection. That's when I became aware of it, the odor. You know how basements often possess that mildly humid old smell? This was different. This was more intense, akin to body odor mixed with stagnant air. I actually asked my wife, "Do you believe there's mold or something down there?" She dismissed the thought, claiming it was likely only the old carpet. And that was the end of the conversation at the time. However, an event occurred that I couldn't simply ignore. Returning to the basement, I came across a blanket folded perfectly on the ground. Now, here's where it became peculiar. We never leave blankets in the basement. There's absolutely no purpose to do so. There's no guest area or anything like that down there. It's just a raw area where we keep seasonal decorations, tools, and odds and ends that don't get much use. I inquired with my wife regarding it, and she acted as though I was making a fuss over nothing. "Oh, it's just an old blanket I forgot to bring upstairs," she said, barely glancing up from her phone. But her demeanor felt incorrect. It sounded excessively nonchalant, as if she was trying too hard to appear unconcerned. At this stage, the nagging feeling that something was amiss would not fade. The dwindling food, the strange sounds, the peculiar odor, and the familiar blanket all began to coalesce in my mind, although I still couldn't grasp what they signified. Doubts started creeping in as I questioned my own perceptions. Perhaps I had been indulging in more snacks than normal. Maybe the noises were just my imagination playing tricks on me. It could be that the carpet was the source of the smell. I felt like a horror movie protagonist, ignoring all the red flags until disaster struck. However, something happened last night that I couldn't brush off. I was relaxing in the living room after dinner, occupied with my phone, when I saw my wife discreetly heading to the garage, carrying a big grocery bag. Initially, I didn't give it much thought. She might have been putting something in the freezer or disposing of something, I guessed. Nevertheless, when she returned inside, she was carrying nothing. I asked her what she was doing, and she looked a little surprised before replying, "Oh, just tidying up a bit." That explanation seemed off, but I didn't push the issue. Instead, I waited until she went to sleep and decided to investigate the garage myself. The bag had disappeared. Whatever she had taken out there, it was gone. That's when it dawned on me. What if there was someone else living in this house? It sounded crazy even to me, but I couldn't find a better theory. I contemplated revisiting the basement, but truthfully, I was too scared. The thought of venturing down there alone in the dark and finding someone or something was unsettling. It sent shivers down my spine. I remember telling myself I'd tackle it later, and well, here I am now. In my car, writing this as my wife works. I haven't ventured down into the basement yet, but I know I must. I'm just unsure what I'll uncover, and truthfully, I'm not entirely sure I want to, just an update. I didn't anticipate another post so soon, but a lot has transpired. I honestly don't know how to interpret it all. So last night, I finally took the plunge and decided to investigate. I have to admit, I wasn't ready for the things I discovered. I woke up yesterday with my mind set on unraveling this mystery. My wife seemed perfectly normal, even irritatingly so. She was singing while she brewed her coffee, talking about some office politics, and asking me what I wanted for supper like everything was totally fine. It really threw me because for the last few weeks, she'd been a bit uneasy and preoccupied. But now it was like a switch had been flipped. It felt like she was trying too hard, almost as if she knew I was onto something and was attempting to be overly nonchalant. At one point, she mentioned, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to run a few errands after work this evening. Nothing major, just some tasks I'd been postponing." The way she said it seemed staged, but I just nodded and replied, "Sounds good." Inside my head, I was thinking, this is it. Tonight's the night I find out the truth. Once my wife left for work, I carried on with my day as normally as I could, but I couldn't concentrate on a single thing. As I passed that basement doorway, I always experienced this persistent pull, almost as if it was challenging me to venture inside. Around the noon hour, I made the decision that I couldn't put it off any longer. I reached for a flashlight, took a big gulp of air, and started my descent down the stairs. What immediately struck me was how eerily hushed it was, like things were unnaturally silent. Usually I could hear some background noise from the water heater or the refrigerator on the floor above, but now everything was totally quiet, which made the small hairs on my neck stand up. That particular odor was still there, a little bit faint but completely identifiable, and it intensified as I got closer to the far side of the basement. Then I saw it, a temporary sleeping arrangement tucked away behind some old pieces of furniture that we planned to get rid of. There was an inflatable mattress, a stack of blankets, and a small number of used food containers. It was concealed well enough that you wouldn't spot it unless you were specifically looking for it, but after noticing it, it was totally impossible to disregard. At that moment, my pulse was pounding. I kept thinking to myself that this couldn't possibly be happening. I couldn't believe this was really real. I didn't have a clue what to do, so I just sat on the steps for a bit, gazing at the arrangement and trying to figure out what was going on. My initial instinct was to call my wife right away and demand an explanation, but I chose to hold off until she got home. I wanted to witness her response firsthand. I wanted to find out if she would be dishonest with me or finally tell the truth. That night, when she got home, I was in the living room. I was desperately trying to appear composed. She came inside, gave me a brief peck on the lips, and began unloading her shopping. My heart felt like it was going to leap out of my chest, yet I made myself maintain a composed demeanor. After a little while, I asked her if we could chat for a moment. She glanced up at me, and for a fleeting instant, it seemed like terror flickered across her expression. "Okay," she replied, putting a bag of groceries down. "What's going on?" I didn't hesitate at all. "Who's been residing in our basement?" Her response was instantaneous. She became motionless, her hands still touching the counter, and her complexion lost all color. Initially, I suspected she might refuse to acknowledge it, but instead, she exhaled a nervous breath and confessed, "I was hoping you wouldn't find out." As it turned out, it was her dad. Her distant father, the one she hadn't communicated with for ages because of some complicated family issues she had never completely explained. Apparently, he got kicked out of his place a few weeks earlier and turned up at our place unexpectedly, seeking assistance. She didn't want to tell me because she knew I wouldn't give him permission to stay, and she didn't want to face the conflict. So she opted to conceal him in the basement and quietly bring him food while I was at work or asleep. I was stunned by what I was hearing. I was furious, naturally. I felt totally caught off guard and deceived, but beyond that, I was perplexed. Why hadn't she simply spoken to me? What made her think it was acceptable to keep this hidden from me in our home? I posed all these questions to her. However, she just kept telling me that I wouldn't have understood, that I would have disagreed. We went back and forth for ages. She maintained that she couldn't do anything else because he had nowhere else to stay and she couldn't just reject him. I kept emphasizing that she misled me, that she made a really big decision without even asking me, and that she put both of us into an extremely awkward situation. It felt like we were communicating in different tongues. Neither of us could get the other to grasp where we were coming from. When the night ended, I told her that he needs to leave. I realize that might seem insensitive, but I can't let someone stay in my house without my knowing about it or agreeing to it, even if it's her dad. She pleaded with me to give him some more time, just a week or two to get things sorted out, but I declined. I feel awful for the guy, but this isn't something that I have to handle. She keeps saying I'm being cruel and uncaring, but I think that she was the one who went too far. One final update for everyone. This is going to be my last update because everything has finally come to a conclusion. I am so tired, emotionally depleted, and honestly, I still don't know what I think about everything. Here's the rest of the story. The day after we argued, things were very strained. My wife and I hardly talked to each other as we went through our morning routines. She had this expression on her face that I couldn't interpret, like a mixture of guilt and a rebellious attitude. It was apparent that she wasn't. I wasn't sure if she agreed with my choice, but I believed we could discuss it again once we both calmed down. I went to my job, but something felt off. I kept replaying the argument, and a particular phrase of hers kept gnawing at me. "He has no other options," she stated. It seemed so final, as if she had already settled it for both of us that this was his only recourse. Then I knew I needed to find out more about this individual. This newcomer residing in my basement, using my resources and complicating my relationship. I was aware of parts of his background, but just the details my wife shared with me, and even those were fuzzy. So I made up my mind to investigate a bit. During my midday break, I phoned my wife's sibling. We don't often hang out, but we get along, so I assumed she might offer some understanding. As soon as I brought up their father, her attitude changed. She let out a long sigh and asked, "What's he done this time?" That one line conveyed everything I needed to understand. This wasn't his first instance of difficulty. She gave me lots more details. It turned out their dad had a record of ruining relationships. He had been kicked out of places many times, borrowed money he never returned, and once even stayed with my wife's sister for a spell before she made him leave because he brought some questionable individuals around her children. "He isn't a bad man," that's what she said. "However, he's self-centered. He always passes his issues on to others." I inquired whether my wife. I hadn't breathed a word about him living in our basement, and she hesitated for quite a while before responding. She eventually said no, but I'm not shocked. Her tone conveyed real worry, but also a weariness, as though she'd surrendered to the situation years prior. After I ended the call, a combination of rage and melancholy washed over me. My wife wasn't just keeping her father's situation a secret from me. She was concealing his true nature. It all became clearer then. It wasn't just about her wanting to help a family member. It was about her own feelings of guilt, her unsettled feelings about their connection, and her attempting to rectify something that was most likely unfixable. That evening when I got home, I was prepared to disclose everything. My wife was in the kitchen, casually cutting vegetables as if nothing was amiss, but I could tell she was tense. I told her we had to talk, and she instantly became defensive. "If this is about my dad again, I don't want to," she stated. Yet I pressed on anyhow. I recounted everything her sister had told me. I told her I understood why she felt duty-bound toward her dad, but that it wasn't right to put me in this situation without my agreement. I told her that I couldn't keep living like this, always suspecting what else she might be keeping from me. "This isn't only about your dad," I mentioned. "It's about us. It's about trust." She was silent for a long time. Ultimately, she looked at me and murmured, "I didn't believe it would get this bad." I inquired what she meant by that. That was the moment she revealed her father wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He didn't have a strategy. She just said, "He's just here." I was totally lost. It was the absolute breaking point for me. I explained to her quietly but with conviction that he needed to be gone by the week's end. No exceptions, no loopholes. I added, "If you're going to assist him, that's okay, but not here, not this way." She started to cry and she called me insensitive and cruel. I didn't budge. I said that I wouldn't wreck our marriage for a guy who had already messed up so many other connections in his life. The next few days were a total haze. My wife kept her distance, and I didn't go near the basement at all. I wanted to avoid seeing him, and honestly, I knew I wouldn't be able to remain calm if I did. By Friday, my wife informed me she'd sorted out for him to live with a pal, at least for the time being. I didn't push for specifics. I was just so glad he was finally leaving. When he finally left, it felt like a heavy load had been taken off, but it was plain to see things were different with my wife and me. There was this enormous chasm in our relationship, and neither of us knew how to fix it. She said she was sorry for not being honest with me, though it came across as though she still believed she was right. Perhaps she did. Possibly she believed she was doing what she thought was correct. Yet, for me, it was challenging to get past the fact that she didn't trust me enough to even discuss it with me.